Hello, hello, happy Friday. I have found that these live streams is my most melodic. I have a tendency to kind of like sing the hello. I have no idea why. It's this thing. Maybe I'm trying to differentiate between all the different hellos that I have. But anyways, hello and happy Friday to everyone. Welcome to our live plant consciousness commentary. I am surprised by the paper we're going to talk about today and excited. But I think I'm excited because it's been a good week. I mean, we have I Am Plants that wraps up today. I'm sort of sad that it wraps up today because it's been such an awesome experience and I'm really enjoying the discussions and all of the, everybody's posts and everything. So it's just but it's been a great week and just everything else that's been going on this week between preparing for this, for working on my podcast. I've been onboarding some new clients, which has been very exciting. I'm always excited to have new coaching clients, and I guess it's been a really good week. How's your week been? Hopefully, it's been good too. Okay, today there is just so much going on in this paper. This paper that we're going to be talking about today is, what's the right word I'm going to look at? It's slightly technical. So I just warn everybody that we're probably going to kind of skip around a few of the pages just because some of the pages are the actual, it's been a long time since we've gone into an actual study. Most of what we've been doing here has been commentary on, essays and editorial type pieces and pieces that really talk about some opinion piece and things like that. This, on the other hand, is an actual study. So I warn that because I'm going to do my best to break down what the individual components are, what did they mean, what is the value of it. But this is fascinating. I've only read a part of it because, I like to do it live, but the parts that I've read have been like very, let's just say, unexpected. And I'm going to be super curious to hear your thinking as to why the conclusions that they came to and whether or not this is a nurture versus nature problem or a nature versus nurture, which order, which came first type of thing. Okay, so let me just share my screen. Let's get into it. As always, you know that as we go, you're totally welcome to chat along. Let me find this beautiful paper. All right, here it is. Dun, 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 dun. There it is. My computer's a little bit slow today. Okay, so this is an article. This is not it's article, but it's based on a paper, like a study itself. So this is a study that came out in Life Sciences Education. You will see here that it was submitted in 2014. So it is, what I've done now is, I think we've caught up on so much of the plant consciousness. I have so many papers that I have collected and have kind of skimmed through over the years, and I have them in two different repositories. So now I've been combining these two repositories so that we can get a little bit of a better jump. I had thought for a while that I would do this by theme, but I think that for us to get a much more complete picture of what it's, the whole plant critical studies in general, I think it's better for us to do more kind of time-based than to try to go theme-based. The reason for this is because I feel like if we go theme-based, we're going to miss some of the discoveries and some of the understandings and some of the conversations that have helped us orient the discussion that we're having today. In the sense that when you just go, like, for example, remember at the very beginning when we started this plant commentary, we were looking specifically at the whole discussion with neurobiology and plant neurobiology. And while that at that time was really important because there weren't many other conversations going on. There were some physiology pieces that were coming into play, and we were picking up some of those that helped, but it didn't make sense to kind of like jump between all the communication studies about how plants communicate and stuff, because that's pretty well-known information, and there wasn't any controversy or any need to really get into it, as opposed to the discussion around plant neurobiology and human neurobiology and one discarding the other was something that we kind of needed to look at from the beginning to where we are today. Now at this point, now that we're in the 2010s and we're going to be going into the 2020s, what is coming up is much broader in nature. And I think that that's much more interesting and exciting to be able to understand, fully understand our plant friends, is to look at things with a much more broader approach. Mind you, I am a broad person. I am not a specialist in the sense of, yes, I specialize in plants, but I've never been one of those people that is just like extremely fantastic at one thing. I tend to be somebody that looks at the big picture. So what I'm giving you is a big picture, but as always, I include the citations when I publish the replay so that you could go off and study this and then go off on any kind of tangent. And I highly encourage you to go off on any tangent that you want to go off on, because this is important. Okay, so this is a plant this is not a plant. This is a human physiology paper to a certain extent. This is really this is science discovering that one of the things that we have associated with a social problem could very well be that is also a physiological problem. And this is where, again, I want you to pay attention and I want to hear your thoughts, because the question is, did the social lead to the physiology, to the physical problem, or does the physiology lead to the social? Or are they two things that developed on their own? There's so many questions here to ask, so we're going to dive in. This paper is called Attention Blinks Differently for Plants and Animals. Obviously, we're just going to focus. In this case, when they say for plants and animals, it's more like attention blinks differently for plants than animals, or plants and animals in the sense like we're looking at plants and we're looking at animals differently. This is by Benjamin Balas and Jennifer Momsen. So here it tells us where they are. They're for the Center for Visual and Cognitive Neuroscience and the Department of Biological Sciences. Again, this is looking at human physiology in relation to cognitive understanding of things. This is not looking at plant cognition. This is not thinking about how plants operate. This is a purely human situation, but it is a human situation pointed towards plants. And that's what makes this so fascinating. So as always, we're going to start with the abstract and then we're going to dive right in. If you have any questions at all, you just type them up as we go. Today's tea is green of Fukumasaka. I finally said it right, Fukumasaka. Very good, very nice. Not that that matters, but you know, we need a little. Okay, so attention blinks differently, and this is really interesting, and you'll find out why the blinks is in quotes. Plants, to many, are simply not as interesting as animals. Unfortunately, so true a statement that has nothing to do with us. Students typically prefer to study animals rather than plants, and recall plants more poorly, and plants are underrepresented in the classroom. Isn't that the truth? I mean, we discovered that when we were doing our creative greenhouse with the Nandini's homeschooling lesson plan that she was planning on developing. And when we started to poll the children around us, we learned that children don't study plants when they're younger. I mean, like 6, 8, they're still not studying anything of plants. And keep that in mind as we continue on with the actual problem space they're testing. The observed paucity of interest for plants has been described as plant blindness, a term that is to encapsulate both the tendency to neglect plants in the environment and the lack of appreciation for plants' functional roles. While the term plant blindness suggests a perceptual or attentional component to plant neglect, few studies have examined whether there are real differences in how plants and animals are perceived. Here, we used an established paradigm in visual cognition, the attentional blink. So the attentional blink is the blink in the sense of when our attention is turned on and off. So that's what they mean by attentional blink. It is the blink of attention, not, the other way around. So it's not the blink in the sense of it is the eyes, but in the sense of what do I see, what do I not see? When is I turned on my vision and when is it turned off? to compare the extent to which images of plants and animals capture attentional resources. We find that participants are better able to detect animals than plants in rapid image sequences, and that visual attention has a different refractory period when a plant has been detected. These results suggest there are fundamental differences in how the visual system processes plants that may contribute to plant blindness. We discuss how perceptual and physiological constraints on visual processing may suggest useful strategies for categorizing and overcoming zoocentrism. I have no idea how I had never heard about this paper, and nobody is talking about this at all. This paper, from what we get from the abstract, and wait till we actually get into it to let's see if what we understood from the abstract is what was really happening. But this is implying that our human way of seeing, that our visual aspects are wired to a certain extent physiologically to have a harder time distinguishing plants. Now, contrast that to the fact that our eyes are tuned to more shades of green than almost any other color. And you explained to me the contradiction there. I hope they're going to address that because I am just so curious as to how that happens. But what I do like that they put into the abstract, first of all, I love that they did this because I think it is important, although there's always that risk that then they say, oh, this is a physiological thing, and it's almost like proving that plants are less important than animals. That's why I like this last line, which is that they discuss the perceptual and the physiological constraints, and they suggest useful strategies for categorizing and overcoming them. The idea is that if this is a physiological exercise, it's what I read from this, and of course I'm biased. I'm totally honest to admit that I'm biased. I am biased, but what I'm reading here is, if you think about all of this as a muscle, here are some exercises to here's what you could do to exercise this muscle and therefore get this muscle to be stronger. And I think that this is really interesting for all of the people, you know, all of you that are connected to children in some ways, either in a directional familial role or who are working in educational settings. I think this could be really interesting to help us better understand what we can do with children to help them see and help them not step out of plant blindness if it is today a physiological response. I, of course, again, being biased, think that this is conditioning that has led to atrophy that has caused the physiological problem, but I could be wrong, and this could be something that we're born with, and this is part of our, from a spiritual perspective, part of what we're working on in the reunification of the mother worlds, that it could be that we are currently born with this out of the separation of the human world and the plant world, and that it is part of our mission as humans to start to reunite this. And one of the ways we can reunite this is from a physiological perspective. But again, I am biased, and that's the way I choose to look at things. So let's find out what exactly it says. Introduction. Botanists have long observed and lamented the routine neglect of plants in textbooks and lectures. Students from kindergarten through college can better recall the names of animals and prefer to study animals. Perhaps not surprisingly, undergraduate botany majors are declining nationally, to the extent that data on botany majors are no longer reported by the National Center for Education Statistics. So to this extent, this is anecdotal data, but I listen, as you know, to a lot of podcasts and I read a lot of papers and I read a lot of studies and I read a lot of stuff. One of the podcasts that I absolutely love called In Defense of Plants, he, every episode, he has some plant specific specialist, you know, a researcher, a person that is connected to the plant world in some ways, usually very specific, like very detailed PhDs that are working on really, just super interesting, but very specific type of research. And he always starts by asking them how they got into plants, in the sense of how did they end up where they are. I will say, and again, anecdotal data, so many of them started off with dinosaurs, with animals, with geology, with whatever. So few of them started off always being in love with plants. they did love the natural world and they thought that plants were cool in general, but so few of them actually started from the plant perspective. So I can understand why there's a dwindling, amount of people going into any kind of botany or plant related majors. Although I would also wonder if today there are more people that are going into plant critical studies or plant humanities, but I don't know if that's actually a good thing because it still means that research is not going to happen on plants, and that's really necessary. Anyways, moving ahead. Why are plants typically ignored and neglected by students, teachers, and the general public? Initial hypotheses focused on education, labeling the undergraduate life sciences curriculum as zoocentric or zoo-chauvinistic. I'm going to write that word down. Zoo-chauvinistic. Oh my goodness, that is just a beautiful word. Hold on, I got to write that. Zoo-chauvinistic. That is, instruction in textbooks reflects a pervasive belief, a pervasive belief that studying animals is more important than studying plants. Indeed, elementary school science textbooks include more animal content as evidenced in the number of diversity of images, the quantity of text, and the number of animal examples of core biological concepts. Something we discovered in our creative greenhouse, working, as I said earlier, on Nandini's homeschooling program. How sad that so much is focused on animals and not so much on plants, and yet we can live without many animals, but we cannot live without many plants. Good thing I don't spike my tea because, sometimes it would take the edge off. Okay, indeed, in elementary school, However, such claims of zoocentrism imply that instructors and textbooks authors actively choose to omit plant examples in favor of animals. Oh no, I don't think that. I just think they don't think about it. While certainly plausible, there is no evidence to support such claims. It's kind of like, I hate to use this example, but it is true, male chauvinism and, gender chauvinism in general isn't necessarily in many contexts something that you think of anymore directly. Sure, there are the people who are like, women shouldn't do this role or whatever, but so many people don't even realize it, that when they imagine roles like engineer or when they imagine doctor or when they imagine truck driver, they in their minds already picture a man doing them. So I think that the zoocentrism or the zoo-chauvinistic behavior that we have happening today, there are not people out there who are saying we should eliminate that plant. I really just think they don't see it. And I guess we're going to find out now, however. Let's see. While certainly plausible, there is no evidence to support such claims. Indeed, it is possible that instructors and authors are implicitly biased against plants. That is, they are unaware that they include substantially fewer plant examples in their curriculum. The pervasiveness of plant neglect is not only the undergraduate and high school biology curriculum, but in society in general, prompted several researchers to consider a broader explanatory mechanism. Wandershee and Sussler, drawing on the visual cognition research, introduced the idea of plant blindness. So if you're ever looking for where that term comes from, it comes from 1999, was when they coined it. Wandershee and Sussler, which are the ones that really became the spearhead on this. Now, after this paper is 2014, this term from a research perspective has been changed, or in the sense that there is a movement, let me say it this way, to move from plant blindness to plant disparity disorder. That's what it's called, plant disparity disorder, PDD. Because the idea is that by calling it plant blindness and saying it's a problem, it's almost like saying that human blindness is a problem, which I can understand because, me, I'm people are not disabled, but diversely abled. So plant blindness instead, where plant disparity disorder would imply that there is a disparity between the way we see plants, and which could be societal, cognitive, or it could be physiological. And therefore that is the disorder. I kind of hate the term in the sense of plant disparity disorder. It's wordy and hard to remember, but I do see the logic of changing away from plant blindness, even though it's easy to understand, because it it's kind of the reverse of what we talk about when we're talking about like all these things like neurobiology, human and plant. The fact that there is plant blindness and that there is human blindness, and they really mean two different things. And one of them is a problem that needs to be absolutely solved, and the other one is something society today is calling a problem, but it's probably not necessarily something we need to solve because it's something that the person is born with and has other capabilities. Really pulls it in. Yeah, and selective inattention instead of plant blindness is another way, but it's not very specific to just the plants. Selective inattention, which is what we're going to talk about here. This paper is basically proving, from what I understood, the opposite, that it is not selective inattention. It is biological inattention. And so we're going to get into that. And that's the reason why selective inattention is not a good phrase, because selective inattention kind of makes it seem as if it's something you do on purpose, and it is not. It's an inherent bias that needs to be rectified in another way. So, but let's get into this and we'll see. And I think we could have another, I can pull up some papers and some studies and some that talk about this idea of plant disparity versus plant blindness versus selective inattention, and see what the different phrases are coming on. I'll make myself a note to do that in a future commentary. The pervasiveness of plant neglect is not only the undergraduate and high school biology, but okay, we've already talked about this. Sorry, I just realized. As defined by Wandersee and Schussler, plant blindness is both the inability to notice plants in their environment and a failure to recognize and appreciate the utility of plants to life on Earth, coupled with a belief. Shouldn't Earth there be a capital E? I know that the grammar in me, but life on Earth, in this case, the planet, would be capital E. Talk about another bias right there, like selective inattention. Coupled with the belief that plants are somehow inferior to animals. This multifaceted definition recognizes cultural contributions to plant blindness, while also introducing the idea that visual perception may limit people's ability to see and, by extension, value plants. Experimental support of plant blindness as a perceptual or cognitive phenomenon is currently limited to a single study. Schussler and Olzak presented undergraduate psychology and botany students with a series of plant and animal images to test the hypothesis that undergraduate students will recall more animals than plant images. After viewing the images, students were briefly distracted before being asked to list as many of the plant and animal image they could recall. Students, even botany students, recalled more animals than plants. The results suggest that plants are to some extent more weakly encoded than animals. And from a educational perspective, this is actually, I mean, if you think about our education, right, we learn things like tiger, lion, zebra. We learn animals, these species, but we learn the most what we consider now to be the most notable ones. What are the notable, even just let's limit it to tree species that we learn? I mean, we maybe do deciduous versus conifer, maybe, versus evergreen, maybe. We might maybe talk about in school a pine tree versus an oak, maybe a maple in some places, especially if you're from Canada. But when do we go and sure, okay, aloe versus a cactus, but even just cactus, we this huge category of cacti, and we just lump them all together, or the giant lumping that is succulents. I mean, the only one that's been able to come out has been aloe, probably. But we don't go into, you know, plants in general unless you have a lot of house plants. Our educational system doesn't show us things like peace lily and, you know, spider plants, and I'm just looking around my own house, you know, Christmas cactus versus looking out and saying beech tree or rowan tree or birch. Like, we don't really teach any of that. So obviously, if I was to show a visual image of plants versus animals, it is way easier for me to recognize and remember that I saw a lion, I saw a zebra, I saw a lion, a tiger, and a bear, oh my, than it is for me to say that I, you know, saw a magnolia and a Japanese maple, and I saw a grass. Like, it's one of those funny kind of things. And you said Anne says in the comments, I do agree that blindness is not analogous with the lack of awareness. So I like that folks are thinking about different terminology. Exactly. And I think that this is the positive of it. I think plant disparity syndrome or plant disparity disorder is a little, I don't know, wordy. I think we could have thought about something different. But yeah, Veronica mentions the fact that her nephew had said, I had never, ever, ever heard about plants in school. I can't remember how old he was. He is, but he's relatively young. And we were testing out and looking in the naturally conscious community. What are the children in our families? Look, he's 7. He's 7, and this is the case. Okay, such results are promising. So going back to the fact that plants are more weakly encoded than animals. Such results are promising but limited because the K-16 life sciences curriculum appears to overrepresent animals as evidenced by textbook studies. It is possible that students have built a robust mental infrastructure that better supports the recall of animals over plants. Even when images of very common plants like pumpkin, I didn't even look at me, my own bias. I didn't even think about all the plant food, like the plants that are food-based that we think of as food. Pumpkin, corn, and carrot are used. Thus, a recall task measures the effects of an already zoo-centric curriculum on students' ability to remember organisms. And this is another important thing. Like when we think of plants, I'm even talking here about my own bias, so I'm going to be very honest. I have to admit that the first images that come to my head are all of the plants, for example, that I see outside of my window or the plants that I see in the wild. I don't really think first and foremost about pumpkin, corn, and carrots and the cabbage that's in my refrigerator right now, or any of those types of plants. I think about house plants and I think about wild plants, but I do not think about agricultural plants. So there's another bias that I think we need to give a little bit of a title to, because I am actively going to be working on that. Recalling or naming a plant image is inherently an act of remembering, not perceiving. That is, whether or not a particular item in a previously studied set of stimuli is recalled later depends on a range of factors, including the visual similarity of the target item to distractors, the phonological similarity of the target item's name to distractors, the visual salience of the target item, and so on. Even if we assume that the properties are well matched for plant images and animal images in a memory task, it is difficult to determine from this result what aspects of visual memory may differ for plants and animals. During retention, the interval when information about an item may be remembered must be maintained, usually a delay between study and test. Do plant images decay more rapidly than animals? Another possibility is that the plant images are not robustly encoded in the first place. The visual description of a plant that is to be remembered may not be as complete or rich as that of an animal that is to be remembered. Finally, does plant blindness reflect a failure to adequately store information about plants, or is there some failure to adequately see or attend to plants in the first place? By attention, we refer to observers' ability to select some subset of the environment for future processing, e.g., signaling out of a particular object to study more closely. For technical definitions, blah, 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 they CCC. We suggest that experimental studies that investigate this latter question, whether or not observers have differential abilities to perceive plants and animals, are desperately needed. In response to this need, we have adapted techniques from research in visual perception to provide empirical evidence that our attention is captured differently by plants than by animals. Specifically, we demonstrate that visual attention to plants is deployed differently than to animals, leading to measurable differences in how well attention can be redeployed following plant versus animal detection. To show this, hopefully this is clear. So basically what they're trying to say is they're in the previous studies around the idea of remembering, a list of plants that you saw versus animals that you saw. There are many other factors that could be in play right now than to understand whether this is that you just didn't see the plants at all, Or is it that you never properly encoded the plant because maybe you didn't have a frame of reference to how the plant was called? Or maybe there was some step set of the environment that distracts you. So you recognize the plant, but then you're distracted. And so you forget that you recognize the plant. Like there's lots of other things. So what they're saying is, we're going to go look at visual attention, and we're going to devise a study that has this to minimize some of those variables in order to come back. Okay, so they have taken advantage of an established phenomenon in visual perception known as attentional blink, which is particularly useful means of objectively measuring the extent to which people detect plants and animals in a quantitatively different way. So let's talk about what is let's talk about, and yeah, so Michelle brings up a good point, which is that she read somewhere something a while ago that that we as human beings are hardwired to track movement, either to hunt or prevent being hunted. And this is another question of bias, right? Going back to the fact that when we were hunter and gatherers, of course, we have this acumen for being able to see movement. This is true, but I would challenge this answer based on my research into those times, because you were equally as attuned to finding plants, at least edible plants, that you could recognize. So I think there was a much more, and if you go and you look at tribal culture today in places like the Amazon, from what I have studied and what I have learned, but I am totally open for an expert who comes in here and tells me that I'm either right or wrong, either which way. But it's the fact that because so many plants could be poisonous, or so many plants could be rare and difficult to find, the eye in those parts of the world are much more attuned to being able to see very specific plants in a large environment. So yeah, we could be hardwired to track movement when we're in hunting mode, but we could be equally hardwired to seeing plants and individuating plants, because as gatherers, that is where our food and our medicine comes from as well. Something interesting that could be studied from what I've read from studies about tribal or indigenous people that really relied on especially forest environments, I don't know, I have this feeling that both cases are can be hardwired into us, or can be programmed into us. Worth researching more. Let's go into attentional blink. Attentional blink, attentional blink, or AB, so we're shortening it to AB, is a robust phenomenon in visual perception in which detecting the first two targets in a sequence of rapidly presented images compromises the ability to detect the second target for a short time. So typically, participants in AB tasks are asked to perform a dual target detection task. Within a sequence of letters presented very rapidly, participants might be asked to report the presence of either the letter T or the letter X, for example. On any given trial, an instance of the first target, referred to as T1, or the second target, T2, may or may not be present. In general, participants are successful, so target T1 is in target 1, the T, or T2 is in target 2, which is the letter X, may or may not be present. In general, participants are successful at reporting the presence or absence of T1 accurately. That is, visual detection and recognition, even for complex targets, is highly efficient. However, the successful detection of T2 depends critically on T1. If T1 is absent, T2 is typically reported accurately. If T1 is present, however, and T2 appears in the image sequence within approximately 500 milliseconds of T1's appearance, T2 is less frequently reported as being present. This time-dependent decrement in T2 detectability is typically accounted for by describing visual attention as a limited resource. The first target captures your visual attention. Disengaging from the target takes time, thus freeing up resources for visual attention, meaning that subsequent targets appearing too close to the first are frequently missed because there is insufficient resources available. In other words, attention blinks. I didn't know that. That's really fascinating. So if you're looking for in a sequence, you know how sometimes you're scanning things and you're looking for like two things in that scan? Now you know that the reason you might miss one of them is because they come too close together. I never knew that. The nature of T1's impact on T2 has been used to define properties of visual attention in general, and also to quantify the extent to which different target categories drive visual attentions exogenously. That is, even though attention blinks are some targets so salient that they are better detected than others, even if they appear during the post-T1 refractory period. Oh, that's a question, sorry. Okay, so the question is, even though there are attentional blinks, are there some targets so salient that they are better detected than others, even if they appear during the post-T1 refractory period? In some reports, T2 targets that are highly salient because they are visually dissimilar to T1 or because they depict arousing words or images can overcome the attentional blink, suggesting that stimulus properties can sometimes overcome some of the intrinsic limitations on visual attention. Oh, that's really fascinating. So basically, if the stimulus itself is so powerful, something that we recognize so well or something that's so connected, then even though it's within that attentional blink, my eye still captures it and is able to detect it, even though it would be within that period of time. In the current study, we adopt similar logic to determine whether plants capture attention less effectively than animals, using attentional blink as a means of quantifying attentional engagement. Specifically, we designed an A/B task in which plants or animals were used as T1 targets, so we can measure the relative impact of target images in each category on the subsequent detection of unrelated T2 targets, pictures of water. Rather than examine what factors may contribute to distinct T2 targets being more detectable than others during the A/B, our hypothesis was that differences in attentional engagement for plants versus animals, possibly as a result of plant blindness, should lead to differences in the impact of plant-animal T1 targets on T2 detection. That is, let's try to see if they put it into words that we understood. Plant blindness is a result, that is, if plant blindness is a result of failure of visual attention, reduced attention to plants should be manifest in our A/B task of improved detection of T2 targets. So this means that if plant blindness, remember, we talked about that. The T1, T2 says that if I have T1 and T2 and I'm looking for these two targets in a sequence that I'm looking at very quickly, when I detect T1, okay, so I've detected the first target somewhere in my thing. If the second target is within 500 milliseconds, I will probably not see the second target unless the second target is just so salient that it just focuses my attention. So what they're saying is that the way that they're devising the test is that if plant blindness is a result of a failure of attention, which means it doesn't really catch my attention, reduced attention of plants, it should manifest in our A/B task as improved detection of T2 targets when plants are used as T1 relative to when animals are used. So this means that if my T1, so the first thing I'm supposed to detect is a plant, because I have plant blindness, I will more easily detect T2, or I will even see T1, but I will more quickly see D2 afterwards, even if it's within that 500 milliseconds, because I don't really detect the plant in a way that is substantive to capture my attention. That's what I understood. If you understood differently, let me know. The standard A/B paradigm also affords us the opportunity to examine potential differences in T1 detection for plants and animals, an additional measure of how detectable plants and animals were in rapid sequences of images. Our study is a novel application of theories and paradigms from visual cognition to examine the possible perceptual bias of plant blindness. Okay, so I'm going to give you some basic information. We're probably going to go through this next part, which is the whole methods part, pretty fast. If you do want to go into the actual breakdown, again, I will post the links to where you can download this paper and you can read it and go through it. So the method, they recruited 24 participants, 14 of them female. I like how they just put how many female. Like they don't say 14 female. I don't know. Really? 14 female, 10 male. Maybe there's some others in there, like Should that be, anyway, sorry. From the North Dakota State, North Dakota! Sorry, Lori. North Dakota State University Introductory Psychology Study Pool, which allows students to sign up online for a variety of ongoing experiments being conducted. Students, okay, yeah, this is how they do it. They have to say all this because they want to make it more clear and there has to be transparency. Let's see, participants receive course credit, blah, blah, blah. We don't actually care about this. Consent is, after consent was obtained, participants were told that the goal of the study was to determine observers' ability to detect different kinds of images and sequences of rapidly presented images, and the dual target detection paradigm was explained to them. So thank you, Lori. So North Dakota University, North Dakota State University is an agriculture school, very plant focused. Oh, also in bed with Mansetto. That's not good. Okay, our stimulus. Oh, it's also your alma mater. Fantastic, Lori. So now you know, studies being carried out. So, you know, they might be in bed with Monsanto, but at least they do some cool studies like this. Other stimulus set was made up of full color images of natural objects and materials belonging to a number of distinct categories. Distractor images, stimuli that were never detection targets, were composed of images of stone and plastic drawn from the Flickr materials database. Target images of plant foliage were taken from the same database. We excluded any images that included an animal, e.g., an example, a bee hovering near a flower, were focused exclusively on a single flower or were of dead plant matter, e.g. logs, dried leaves, whatever. So just the overall plants. Because the Flickr materials database did not have a suite of animal images, of course it didn't, it has a suite of plant images, but not target animal ones because animals are just common. Target images of animals were collected from a variety of online sources and depicted a range of species. Finally, target images of water were also drawn from the database. Our full stimulus was made up of 50 images per category, and all images were cropped or resized to be 512 through 384. Anyways, they're all the same size. T1 and T2 targets were selected such that no image contained an instance of multiple categories that were task relevant for the individual participants. Images of plant and animals did not contain water, for example. This is critically important because we did not want participants to be confused about whether or not an image containing a plant and water should be considered as plant detection or water detection or both. We note that some images of animals did include plants, but because plants, this is an interesting one to see how they explain this. Because plant and animal targets were presented to different groups of participants, these images did not introduce any task ambiguity for our observers, and thus should not have impacted performance. It would be interesting to see it. You can always download the images to take a look. Okay, we adopted a standard AD paradigm, so this is the procedure to examine the extent to which detecting plants and animals in a rapidly presented sequence of animals affected the subsequent detection of a second target in the sequence. So we presented participants with a series of images. We presented the participants with a series of images sequences, each composed of 24 images. The participant's task was to view each sequence and determine whether or not the sequence contained an image belonging to either of two predetermined target categories. Half of our participants were asked to detect images of plants and images of water, plant condition, while the remaining half were asked to detect images of animals and water. So T1 targets. Okay, so either a plant or an animal as a T1 target, and then water as a T2 target. So the idea is, what I think they're trying to test in their hypothesis is that if plant blindness exists, then when you detect the plant, you will, within the 500 millisecond window, detect the water because the plant doesn't stay relevant to you. As opposed to when you recognize an animal, you would not be able to detect water if it's within that 500 millisecond. This is my assumption based on this, but let's find out what their stimuli. On each trial, the images sequences were constructed such that T1 targets, if present, would appear within the middle third of the sequence. sequence, frames 9 through 11, with the specific position determined on each trial via independent uniform sampling of the relevant sequence interval. T2 targets, if present, appeared with equal frequency, one of 8 lag positions following the T1 target. Specifically, T2 targets could appear either 1 to 8 frames after the T1 target for image sequences in which the T2 target was present, but no T1 target appeared. T1 position was matched across the trial. So this is just kind of explaining where exactly they put things in order to map out that famous 500 millisecond that I was talking about, and which is what they're really testing more than anything. The specific images comprising were randomly selected, as you can imagine. Participants completed 20 repetitions of each cell in the design, yielding a total of 640 trials per experimental section. The full experimental session was split into 2 blocks, and the trials were presented in fully randomized order in order to participate. As a person who has now been able to design a test for this type of stuff, oh my God, they are so incredibly complex. You have to think about all the possible bias combinations, trying to limit them based on what you're doing. And you could have so many runs. When we were designing the effects, the study on the effects of plant music on human health, it was so interesting to see how many possibilities we could have tested. Like, do you test with plant music and the human where the plant is in the room? Do you plant with live plant music and the person where the plant is not in the room? Do you test with and then where do you have, when you have a recording, is the plant in the room or should the plant not be in the room? Do you test for both? Because that way there's a different, oh, it gets really far. Okay, so this tells us what kind of hardware they use, that participants were in a darkened room. They talk about within an image sequence, the amount of time. This is also that there could be repetition. Following the completion of the sequence, participants were presented with 2 response screens. The first screen asked participants, did you see any either plant or animal? The second screen asked, did you see any water? Participants had unlimited time to respond to these questions and were asked to respond to each screen by using the Y and N keys. So here's an example, predetermined, okay. That's the part we care about. Overall, we were interested in 2 different ways of comparing the extent to which images of plants and animals by Lori captured participants' attention in a rapidly presented image sequence. First, how well do participants detect plants versus animals? Second, how does the presence of a plant or animal impact the detection of subsequently presented targets that belong to neither category? T1 detection, hit rates and false alarm rates. To address the first question, we compared T1 detectability, so T1 is either a plant or an animal, between our plant and animal groups using both hit rates, successfully detecting T1 when it was present, and false alarm rates, indicating T1 was present when it was not. We calculated the T1 hit rate and the false alarm rate, and then compared these values via two-tailed independent sampling. So here's an interesting one right there. Proportion of hits versus false alarms. If we're looking for plants, hit rate, look how the hit rate is different from the animal rate. How often they were able to detect the animals versus the plants. I was actually surprised. They were pretty good on the hits. So T1 false alarm rate, how often they thought the plant was present when in reality it wasn't, how many times they thought an animal was present when it actually wasn't. And you will see that it's more often than not when you sort of thought that there was a plant. It's interesting. I'm curious as to how they thought about that. Two false alarm rates. So this is when water was not present, how often did they think that the water was present? And this is interesting how between animals and plants, this false alarm rate is about the same. So basically, participants in plant group were generally less sensitive to T1 targets than participants in the animal rate group. Hit rates were significantly lower for plant targets than animal targets, and false alarm rates were higher for animals. We've also included the average T2 false alarm rate, which did not differ across the participants. Okay, wait. Okay. Okay, let's see. I don't want to read the actual. Both outcomes suggest that plant images are harder to detect than animal images. Participants both see plants left often when they are present and more frequently report the plants occur when they do not. To confirm that the observed differences in T1 detection were not simply the result of plant images that were ambiguous, we ran an additional norming study to determine how categorizable our plant images were as plants. We recruited 24 participants um, to view our plant images and indicate whether or not each image depicted a plant or not. Participants were free to view each image for as much time as they liked and labeled each image as plant or not a plant. We found that only one image from our stimulus set was labeled as a plant by fewer than 23 of our 24 observers. This single image was labeled as not a plant by 4 observers. Overall, these results strongly suggest that all but one of our plant images were easily categorizable as plants, and the impact of this single image out of the set of 50 is unlikely to be substantial. So, okay, that's a good thing too. They did measure whether or not these are easily recognizable plants because these are important factors. If you think you have an image of a plant, because I don't know, I see plants all over the place, but in reality, somebody else looks at that and thinks that it's shoelaces or thinks that it's a pole, then that's not a very good study. So this is a really great piece that they introduced. To address our second question, we compared T2 hit rates across the plant and animal groups as a function of T1 presence or absence and the lag between T2 and T1 when T1 was present. This is what I was saying about the 500 milliseconds. So we already recognize that in general, there is a statistically significant decrease in the rate of being able to see plants in general. So that's part of the plant blindness. Now we're going to talk about the T2 hit rates, that attentional blink, and whether or not that occurs. In general, the presence of T1 is expected to negatively impact hit rates with some temporal window following T1 onset. T2 should be easier to detect when T1 did not appear earlier in the sequence. Our question is whether or not the impact of T2 hit rates differs according to whether or not T1 is a plant or an animal. We calculated T2 hit rates for each participant at each lag point. Blah, 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 blah. Like this is exactly what they did. Hold on. They're just talking about what they've done in order to kind of try to alleviate any kind of bias that might happen. Hold on, I'm getting there. Okay. Our analysis revealed a main effect of lag position, but no main effect of participant group. The main effect of lag position was the results of significantly lower T2 rates at a lag position of 2 compared with lag positions of 5 or 8, which simply confirms the presence of an AB. So there is an attentional blink. The main effect was qualified by 2 interactions. Hold on, I'm trying to see if they specify exactly where when T1 was absent, okay, but varied when T1 was present. So basically they're saying that the T2 hit rates were flat across the lag positions when T1 was absent, which is you would expect, right? It's pretty consistent. You see T2, which is the water, even when there is no T1, so there's nothing to distract you, but varied when T21 was present, obviously. But by what factor? Okay, let's see where we get to the conclusion. The discussion. Participant performance in our A/B task suggests that our attention is not captured by plants in the same way as it is by animals. So if we look at our little graph here, right, we see that the darkest line that we're seeing is T1 is a plant, and we're seeing that T2 is when it's the animal, and then T1 a plant, T1 a animal. But hold on, these are just the lag positions. Okay, I was hoping that they would give it. Okay, the difference in sensitivity we observed for a plant versus animal T1 targets demonstrates that plant images are less reliably detected in an image sequence than animals. So that's the first bias. Participants are more likely to miss plant images that are present and to falsely report seeing a plant when one was not present. Okay. though adult observers are generally credited with impressive accuracy in rapid serial visual presentation tasks. Our data suggests that some targets are more easily detected than others. Thus, plant blindness may result from differences in how attention is deployed to plants. Specifically, it is harder to notice plants. Besides this difference in sensitivity to plant versus animals, we also observe differences in the attentional blink for T2 targets that followed plant versus animal T1 targets. Broadly, our results is consistent with prior results demonstrating that T2 detection is modulated in some circumstances by how attention is allocated to other arousing and engaging items. The differential impact of plant targets compared with animal targets suggests that visual attention has a different refractory period when a plant has been detected, which implies that attentional resources are deployed differently for plant targets. Man, they just make these things redundant. I mean, I get what they're saying, but I want the actual results. Animal targets appear to induce an immediate decrement in T2 detection, while plant targets did not appear to have an influence until later. The magnitude of performance decrement for T2 detection appears to be more or less the same at its peak for plants and animals, but the peak does not arrive as quickly for plants. Put another way, attention to plants is delayed, but not reduced relative to attention to animals. So it's delayed. It takes us longer to detect. I wonder, this is me wondering out loud, if in part, some of this is because if I know I am supposed to be looking out for an animal or for a plant, I like focus. And I wonder if that's the reason why it's delayed, but it's not. You understand what I'm trying to say? Like almost, okay, let me just read this. Let's see. Where are we? Considered together, the data from T1 and T2 target detection demonstrate that plants are not detected as robustly as animals in the first place, nor do they capture attention resources as quickly. Plant blindness, thus, may result in part from differences in the visual processing of plants versus animals. An important caveat to these results is that in this experiment, we did not attempt to closely match our plant and animal images in terms of low-level visual properties. That is, our images of plants potentially differ from our images of animals in terms of the spatial frequency, content, color, and luminance histograms and visual texture. This means that our results may be driven by some aspect of high-level visual processing, a difference in how plants and animals are processed at levels of the visual system that are largely robust to image-level appearance. Or they may be driven by low-level properties of the image that convey with plant-animal categories, a difference in how plants versus animals typically look that is not necessarily about plants per se. However, while this is important to acknowledge, so our results can be contextualized relative to other studies in visual cognition literature. We suggest that this distinction between low-level and high-level contributions to our effect is not critically important for our purposes. In natural environments, observers routinely encounter real plants and animals that differ in low-level imaging properties. Our use of natural photographs that are also not closely matched, thus reflect the perceptual and attentional processes that are engaged when observers see plants and animals out in the world. Thus, while it would be interesting to identify the perceptual dimensions, they may drive category differences in our A/B task. Okay, so basically they're saying, yeah, sure. Michelle says they need to do the same experiment with 5 to 6-year-olds to see if there's a difference. Then you can draw some conclusions about education impacts. That's a really great point, Michelle. That would be interested. So implications, let's see where we are on this paper to see if we have time. We'll go a little bit over. Yeah, we're right at the end. Okay, implications for extraction. Our results demonstrate a very real difference in human perception of plants and animals and support the conclusion of a visual perceptual component in the definition of plant blindness. We are cautious, however, in extending these results beyond the definition of plant blindness. For example, several critiques of plant blindness have stated the concept itself implies that zoocentric attitudes are both normal and inevitable for humans. Whether plant blindness is normal and inevitable remains an open question. Indeed, we might ask whether humans are blind to plants or simply more attentive to animals. And this is where Michelle's comment would be so interesting, because if you were to do this same test with 5 or 6-year-old, we would already start to create a better understanding of whether or not this is an inherent kind of physiological problem, or is this really more a societal cognitive. That by now, by the time that you become an adult, the problem exists and that it has become physiological. I think that this study starts to show that and really prove it, that it becomes such a part of who you are, that our visual perception, whether that's physiological in the perspective of even cognitive, is there. The question is whether or not we're born with it. And I think that we can't answer unless you do the type of testing with younger children, which might be a little hard to do. We would argue, however, that such disagreements draw attention from what botanists and educators should be focusing on, namely the design of instruction that addresses plant blindness and helps students compensate for and overcome their perceptual limitations. Ah-ho, there it is. That's the answer. For example, suggestions to strive for plant equality, that is, increasing the representation of plants in textbook images and classroom examples, may be insufficient to counter a physiological bias for plant blindness. Uno previously addressed the need to build botanical instruction based on the learning sciences and discipline-based education as a mechanism to target and combat plant blindness. Below, we offer several additional suggestions that emerge from our research on plant blindness. This is great for any kind of educator out there. First, because plant blindness is, in part, a physiological phenomenon, we suggest that instruction should be directly define and address plant blindness. Beginning in introductory biology, students should learn what plant blindness is, including both the possible physiological underpinnings and cultural implications. As part of that instruction, students should learn that plants capture attention differently than animals, and as a result, they are unlikely to see plants in their daily lives. And I think this right now should be something that we should look at, especially in higher education, just because, but I mean, it would be great for it to all start when they're young anyway, although I agree that Michelle, with her study, like to understand that. So Anne says, Rutgers University has done some impressive research on attention and cognition in infants. I would love to see what that group might do with this question. Exactly, because it would change our educational system if we were to do this. So let's see. Second, as noted previously, instruction about plants should reflect what we know about best practices in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in education. Namely, that constructivist learning environments, i.e. active learning, increase student learning. And I'm wondering whether, if you were to have a group of adults that grew up with, like, I don't know, a campus garden, or that grew up in schools that regularly offered forest bathing or hiking experiences, I would be really interested to see if they were to look at the background of many of these students, if they were to repeat this exact same study, but they were to have a difference between, I don't know, a series of people who are foragers, for example, versus hunters, as Michelle said, versus people who are kind of like, you know, in the home and who have a very strong sense. These are all the different permutations of a test that would happen. I think that this is really exciting. Bye, Anne. I'm glad that you were here. Super enjoyed your comments, and I'm looking forward to really hearing more about your thoughts of what are the different educational elements that we could add here. And then let's see, such classrooms go well beyond simply exposing students to the additional plant examples. For example, targeted place-based biodiversity instruction that engaged children in searching for, identifying, and investigating local flora increased both their recognition and appreciation for plants. These student activities tended to wild plants. We might therefore predict that these students are more likely to see plants in their daily lives. Exactly. Such instruction could easily translate into the undergraduate life sciences classroom. For example, observational lab experiences that make use of campus flora would promote student engagement with an observation of local plants and may change how students attend to plants. In the lecture hall, plant blindness might also be combated by curriculum reforms that focus on core biological concepts. This restructuring provides a platform to integrate plants into the life sciences curriculum rather than teaching plants as other or completely different. Agreed with this. This is a great suggestion. Instruction on a particular biological principle, for example, energy acquisition, would use a suite of plant and animal examples. And this is something that I saw a lot of when I was doing more biomimicry. It was wonderful to see when you look at biomimicry, the amount of examples that when you're starting to plan a biomimicry project, a design project, and you're starting to design using biomimicry, it is extremely important for you to look at animal examples as well as plant examples, because there are some things that plants just do really well. For example, the movement of liquids is something that plants do extremely well and that we can learn so much from and that we can apply when we're doing and designing projects. As opposed to when you start to look at that from an animal perspective, more likely you are looking at either behavior, which is a very different thing if you're trying to design, I don't know, some kind of new tubing, or you could look at inner physiology of animals and humans in the sense of veins and arteries and things like that. But in the plant world, there are many more types of examples, from the roots to the limbs to the branches and to many other places. So it is important when you're looking at biological principles of any sort. Most of our education in schools is connected to animals rather than looking at how plants do the same thing, whether it's create energy, transfer energy, move water, use color, all kinds of different things. Finally, we would suggest that botanical instruction should capitalize on the dual coding theory of multimedia learning. This theory assumes learners possess two main channels to process information, auditory and visual, and these channels are of limited capacity. Learning happens as a result of the learner actively selecting, organizing, and building mental representations from incoming information and then integrating it with prior knowledge. Instruction that engages both auditory and visual channels, for example, presenting plant images simultaneously with text or narration, provides more opportunities for learner to engage with botanical instruction. This is also really cool for learning environments like in locu. So whether I teach outside, for example, I've often used the example here when we talk about the education at Zamenhof, the idea that if I can learn better mathematics by building a house, if you're explaining to me as I'm putting things together and you're walking me through the math that is done in order to come up with the angles, with the sizes, with all these types of things. The same is available for plants, right? We are able to look at it. When you think about biology, most of the time you're dissecting animals, you're looking at things from animal references, when instead I'm not encouraging that you dissect neither animals nor plants. But my point is that if you study these, it would probably be much more interesting, and that if you could use more plant examples in these things. Thus leading to meaningful learning about plants. Such deep learning about plants may act to foster student appreciation for plants while facilitating their ability to see, attend to plants in their daily lives. Plant blindness is inherently a complex phenomenon. The cultural underpinnings of plant blindness may have been well recognized. Here, we add to a small body of research documenting a physiological mechanism underlying plant blindness. Our work supports the complete definition of plant blindness put forth by Wandersee and Schussler, and encompassing both limits to human visual perception and cultural constraints. Further studies that clarify just how the human brain perceives and attends to plants can further inform instructional efforts to help learners take concepts towards overcoming plant blindness. Wow, what a wonderful paper that I did not expect to be this interesting. Like, I mean, I'm so happy that I found it. So this article, as I said, this study is called Attention Blinks Differently for Plants and Animals, by Benjamin Balas and Jennifer L. Momsen. And I'm going to kind of keep an eye out for whether or not there are derivative papers that are any kind of study that has been done. But I think that their suggestions are extremely sound. I mean, I think that some of them are logical and we can understand them from the perspective of we should have been thinking about this all along. But I think that by proving that there is a visual perception problem in the sense of the way that we visualize plants is differently to animals, is gives a lot of push to the idea that in our education we need to add much more of a visual or a physical component of plants. And again, I would be super interested to see what happens when you take a study like this and you do it across different demographics to see how that education plays out. So when you look at, for example, hunter-gatherer cultures or foraging, for example, when you look at people who are forest guides and who have a large vocabulary of being able to identify plants as well as animals, I'm very curious as to whether or not that changes, and that would give even more credence to the idea that we need to add this to our educational systems. So super exciting. I am so glad that we went through this together. I look forward to your feedback. Thank you for all of the comments in the chat as we were going along. If you are watching the replay, we love you, and please feel free to add your own comments, any thoughts that you have on this. I'm really curious as to how this changes the way that you think about the education, both in a institutional setting, but also with people around you, in the sense that taking into consideration that plant blindness might now be a visual component that is almost like a muscle that's atrophied. If you were to think about that and you see people who are experiencing plant blindness, how could this information help you design or talk to those people differently and help you in your own perspective of how I can learn or how I can move towards greater plant awareness? So if I'm doing this, if I'm moving from plant awareness, then how could adding more visual elements, both pictorially as well as physically, help encourage that? So rather than talking to people of plant blindness, maybe what we need is to create more opportunities for people to see plants in their environment. I welcome this conversation. I'm super curious as to what your thoughts are on that. And thank you so much for taking the time to be here for this live plant consciousness commentary. I will see you again next week. And until then, remember to resist the urge to hold back your evolving green brilliance. This is me, Tigria Gardenia. I'm out. Bye.